In the hallowed halls of Oxford University, where 8 centuries of academic tradition had unfolded, a silence unlike any other descended upon the Sheldonian Theatre that March afternoon. The weight of history hung in the air, as 500 academics, students, and dignitaries sat in rapt attention. The occasion was a routine lecture on global leadership in the 21st century, part of the university's prestigious African leadership series. The speaker list included world leaders, scholars, and policymakers, each offering their perspectives on development, democracy, and international cooperation. Among them sat Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, unassuming in a simple dark suit, quietly jotting notes in the front row as the event unfolded. No one could have foreseen that within the hour, his words would ignite a firestorm, reverberating across the globe and toppling a titan of academia. At precisely 3:30 p.m., Professor Harrington took the stage. A man in his late 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he exuded the gravitas of a scholar whose career spanned decades. His credentials were impeccable: a Rhodes Scholar, author of 12 books, and holder of 3 honorary doctorates. His work on European history and civilization had cemented his reputation as a towering figure in academia. As he began his lecture on the foundations of modern civilization, his voice carried the confidence of a man accustomed to unchallenged authority. When we examine the pillars of human advancement, he declared, his words echoing through the historic venue, we see a clear pattern. Mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, industrial innovation from Britain. He paused, peering over his glasses at the audience, as if daring anyone to disagree. The foundations of what we call civilization have decidedly Western origins. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the provocative tone. Harrington, undeterred, pressed on, emboldened by the academic setting that had long shielded such views. 20 minutes into his lecture, he delivered the statement that would define the rest of his life. Now, some might ask about other continents' contributions, he said, his tone laced with condescension. Asia gave us gunpowder and paper. Certainly, the Americas had sophisticated calendars. But Africa, he paused dramatically, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor to it. The silence that followed was profound, a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to freeze time itself. In the front row, Ibrahim Traoré slowly closed his notebook. He placed his pen carefully on the desk beside it, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Around him, African students and academics sat frozen, caught between outrage and the daunting prospect of challenging a senior professor in Oxford's most prestigious venue. The moment stretched on, thick with unspoken tension, until Traoré raised his hand. Harrington, visibly irritated, acknowledged him with a curt yes, as if expecting little more than a formality. Traoré stood, his posture calm but resolute. Professor Harrington, he began, his voice steady and clear despite foregoing the microphone, I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may. Harrington's smirk widened, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. By all means, mister, he trailed off, feigning ignorance of Traoré's identity, though the president had been introduced at the event's outset. Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré, he replied simply, omitting his title as president of Burkina Faso. And I accept your challenge. A ripple of anticipation coursed through the audience. Several attendees discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Harrington gestured toward the stage with a dismissive wave. Please, enlighten us, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. But do try to stick to historical facts rather than romantic nationalism. Traoré walked to the podium with measured steps, carrying a simple leather folder. He placed it carefully on the lectern, pausing to survey the audience before locking eyes with Harrington. Professor, he began, his tone even but commanding, before I address your challenge, may I ask you a question? In your extensive research, have you ever visited the manuscript collections in Timbuktu? Have you studied the mathematical treatises of the Dogon people? Have you examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya people in Tanzania? Harrington waved his hand dismissively. Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traoré, he retorted. We're talking about contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities. A few gasps echoed from the audience at the blatant disrespect, but Traoré remained unfazed. He opened his folder and pulled out a single document. Then let us begin with something you might recognize, he said, holding up a photocopy of an ancient text. This is a page from the Lubombo bone, discovered in Swaziland. It is 44,000 years old, Professor. It contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history, 29 distinct notches marking lunar cycles. Mathematics didn't begin in Greece, Professor. It began in Africa. The smirk on Harrington's face faltered, but he quickly recovered. Counting notches is hardly Pythagoras, he scoffed. Undeterred, Traoré pulled out another document. Then perhaps we should discuss the Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 20,000 years old, containing evidence of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. This predates Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years. He paused, letting the weight of the numbers sink in. But you want more recent examples? Very well. Let's discuss the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students in the 12th century, when Oxford was still a collection of drinking halls. The audience was now utterly silent, hanging on his every word. Traoré's voice grew stronger, yet retained its calm dignity. You mentioned law coming from Rome. Shall we discuss the constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which included checks and balances 3 centuries before the American Constitution? Or the Buganda Parliament, which had a complex system of democratic governance while Europe was still ruled by absolute monarchs? Harrington tried to interject, but Traoré pressed on, his authority undeniable. You speak of philosophy from Germany? Have you read the philosophical texts of Zara Yacob, the 17th-century Ethiopian philosopher who developed ideas about rational inquiry and human rights that preceded the European Enlightenment? His student, Valda Haywat, wrote treatises on ethics that rival anything produced in Europe at the time. But of course, they wrote in Guizi, not Latin, so perhaps they don't count in your estimation. Harrington opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré held up a hand, and, astonishingly, the professor fell silent. Isolated examples, you say? Traoré continued. Let me tell you about isolation. It's when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, housed the world's knowledge while the ancestors of Oxford's founders were still living in mud huts. It's when African mathematicians were calculating the circumference of the earth while Europeans believed it was flat. The room was electric with tension. Students who had been slouching now sat upright, scribbling notes. Several professors nodded, some visibly uncomfortable, others seemingly encountering this information for the first time. Traoré's voice rose slightly, the first hint of passion breaking through his composure. You want contributions to civilization? Let's talk about medicine. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in Mali in the 14th century. The first caesarean section where both mother and child survived was performed in Uganda in 1879, using techniques that wouldn't appear in European medicine for another 50 years. The first vaccination, not Edward Jenner's cowpox, but variolation against smallpox, was practiced in West Africa and brought to America by enslaved Africans. He pulled out another paper. Architecture. The Great Zimbabwe's acoustic properties surpass modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids predate their Egyptian counterparts. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela were carved from single pieces of volcanic rock with a precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. But perhaps you've never heard of these because they don't fit your narrative of African primitiveness. Harrington, now visibly sweating, stood at the side of the stage, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease. Traoré pressed on, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Metallurgy. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The bronzes of Benin were so sophisticated that when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans could have made them, inventing theories about lost Portuguese craftsmen. He turned to agriculture. Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. They developed complex irrigation systems in the Sahel that sustained cities of hundreds of thousands. While Europe was mired in the Dark Ages, the terraced agriculture of the Dogon people sustained communities for over 1,000 years in conditions where European farming methods fail within a season. Traoré paused, locking eyes with Harrington. But perhaps most importantly, Professor, let's talk about Ubuntu, the philosophical concept that, I am because we are. While European philosophy was obsessing over individual rights and conquest, African philosophy was developing concepts of restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity that the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to understand. The tragedy, Traoré said, his voice softening but cutting like a blade, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and denigrating those contributions. When the Library of Timbuktu was at its height, housing more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers were tracking the movements of the stars, you called us superstitious. When our healers were performing complex surgeries, you called us witch doctors. He pulled out one final document. This, Professor, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the scholarship that perhaps funded your education. In it, he explicitly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonization. Your ignorance isn't accidental. It's the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase African contributions to human civilization, and you've been perpetuating it for 47 years. The silence in the theater was absolute. Harrington stood motionless, his mouth opening and closing, but no words emerged. Traoré wasn't finished. I could continue for hours, Professor. I could tell you about the astronomical calculations of the Dogon people, who knew about Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could detect it. I could describe the complex fractal geometry in African art that predates Mandelbrot by centuries. I could explain how the call-and-response tradition of African music became the foundation for jazz, blues, rock, and virtually every form of popular music. But I think I've made my point. He paused, his gaze piercing Harrington. The question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, don't know any of this, or worse, why you know it and choose to deny it. The first clap came from a young African woman in the third row. Then another. Within seconds, the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood, followed by professors, and even some administrators joined in. The most striking reaction came from Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies, who rose from the front row. Mr. President, she said, addressing Traoré's title for the first time, as a member of this institution, I apologize. Your words today have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined. The applause surged again, louder still. Harrington, isolated on the stage's edge, looked around desperately for support but found none. His decades of authority had crumbled in 10 minutes. Traoré spoke once more as the applause subsided. I don't seek apologies, he said quietly. I seek truth. And the truth is that human civilization is not the property of any one continent or race. It's the culmination of all human achievement, from the first mathematical calculation on an African bone to the latest scientific discovery. But as long as professors like Dr. Harrington continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, we perpetuate ignorance and prejudice. Today, in this room, we have a choice: continue the lies or embrace the full, rich, complex truth of human achievement. He gathered his papers and returned to his seat, pausing as he passed Harrington. "Professor," he said, his voice low but audible through the microphones, "I've left copies of all these sources with your department. I hope you'll find time to read them." The aftermath was swift and seismic. Within hours, videos of Traoré's response flooded social media, with titles like "African President Destroys Racist Oxford Professor" and "The Most Epic Takedown in Academic History." By the next morning, the clips had garnered millions of views. News outlets worldwide picked up the story, and scholars from African universities provided additional evidence supporting Traoré's claims. The hashtag #AfricaBuiltCivilization trended globally. Harrington issued a statement the following day, announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Oxford University released a formal apology and committed to a comprehensive review of its history curriculum. The Sheldonian Theatre, where the confrontation had occurred, would host a new annual lecture series on African contributions to global civilization, with Ibrahim Traoré as its inaugural speaker. The most profound impact, however, was felt among students. Enrollment in African studies programs surged across British universities. Young historians began traveling to Africa to explore archives long overlooked by Western academia. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, the astronomical knowledge of the Dogon, and the medical practices of traditional healers became subjects of rigorous study. A year later, Oxford unveiled a statue in its main quadrangle. Not of Traoré, who had declined the honor, but of Ahmad Baba al-Timbuktu, the 16th-century African scholar whose 1,600 books on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics had educated generations while Oxford was still in its infancy. The inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, and truth belongs to all humanity." In an interview years later, Traoré reflected on that day. "I didn't go to Oxford intending to give that speech," he admitted. "But when Professor Harrington made his statement, I thought of all the African children who would hear such words and believe them. I thought of the brilliant African minds whose contributions were erased or stolen. I couldn't remain silent." He paused, his eyes distant. The real tragedy isn't what one ignorant professor said. It's that his views were considered acceptable in an institution dedicated to truth and knowledge. How many students sat through his lectures over 47 years, absorbing those lies? How many went on to positions of power carrying those prejudices? That's why I had to speak, not to humiliate him, but to break the cycle. When asked if his response was too harsh, Traoré shook his head. For centuries, African history has been written by those who enslaved us, colonized us, and exploited us. They had no interest in acknowledging our achievements. When you've been denied your history for so long, speaking the truth isn't harsh, it's necessary. Professor Harrington had 47 years to learn the truth. He chose ignorance. I simply chose not to let that ignorance stand unchallenged. The Traoré moment, as it came to be known, is now studied in universities worldwide as a turning point in academic discourse on African history. It serves as a reminder that knowledge requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge entrenched assumptions. It demonstrated that the most powerful weapon against prejudice is not anger or violence, but truth delivered with dignity and backed by irrefutable facts. In classrooms from Lagos to London, Cairo to Cape Town, teachers now begin lessons on African history with a simple, once controversial truth: Africa is not just part of human civilization, it's where human civilization began. The silence that fell over Oxford that day marked not just the end of one professor's career, but the beginning of a long overdue reckoning about whose stories are told, whose achievements are recognized, and whose contributions to humanity are remembered.